Question 1. Earth changes in the headline news. What do you think is the cause? Well, in the news we've seen lots of earthquakes and volcanoes and sinkholes and flooding and extreme storms. And many of these changes were predicted in past cycles that this would happen again. And I want to remind you of 2 items that are clear to me that may have some influence on the earth changes we're experiencing. Actually 3. The first was a solar minimum that was happens cyclically every 11 years. So cycles of the sun can cause earth changes. Things that cause changes to the cycles of the sun are probably the most interesting to me right now. One of those is our location of the solar system relative to the galactic center. And this gets pretty deep and involves the Yuga cycles from the Hindu tradition, which were very focused on the galactic center, as well as the Mayan calendar that counted down to that event. The third thing is potentially an external body disturbing our solar system, like what was discussed in the Enuma Elish, referring to what many people call the 10th planet. So the idea that there's another planet in our solar system that has satellites of its own and it's interacting with our sun is a very significant possibility as well. And I wanted to say I did some calculations based on data that was given to us way back when. I think it was in 2015. I did a blink test using Dr. Robert Harrington's data to see if I could get any closure on where I thought this body would be if it was incoming the way he specified. And my drop dead date was, rough back of the envelope calculation was, if it didn't change any velocities from 1991 to the time it reached solar perihelion, then that would happen in 2019 if it continued at the rate it was going. So we don't really know how long it would take if it sped up, and also that's only at perihelion. That's not coming back out and reaching the Earth's ecliptic, possibly coming in between the Earth and the Sun, which would cause real devastation. So the other thing to keep in mind is if we do have a binary twin like Nibiru's central sun, stationed somewhere 50 billion miles away from the Earth, and it was orbiting in such a way that it came between or sandwiched our solar system between itself and the galactic center, then the energy coming from that binary twin would have much more impact on our solar system than had it been at some other orientation. And that's actually one of the things that's discussed in the astral plane in the Yuga cycles relative to whether we need to look at the vernal equinox or the fall or the spring equinox relative to the galactic center. And right now, if you reference the vernal equinox, which is the fall, relative to the galactic center, we're at a cusp point in the Dwarpa cycle that is supposed to signify very significant changes for mankind, and that may be involved as well. Question 2. Do you think the Mayan calendar, August 11th, 3114 BC, countdown, and the Yuga cycles are correlated? Explain. Well, this countdown date from 3114 BCE was clearly a date counting down to when the Mayans believed we would reach our 5th sun, which was at the galactic center. So how does that relate to the Yuga cycles? Are they correlated? And as I mentioned in the previous question, if you look at the Yuga cycle diagram, and let's go look at that right now. I'll have to scroll down to get it. Here we go. Okay, this is a diagram from Swami Yukteswar, who was Yogananda's teacher. And this came from the Holy Science. And on the left side, you can see the Daiwa Yuga cycle, which is a ascending cycle of 12,000 years. And then you see a descending cycle on the right. It's the Daiwa Yuga cycle, another 12. So he counts 24,000 and doesn't count the time in between that you transit the cycle itself, is what it seems to me, which approximately would last 1,500 years in the middle. Okay, so you can see here's Pisces and Aquarius up in the upper right. And then down on the just opposite of that, you see in the Dwarpa cycle at the 220th point where the arrow is pointing, this was when it was pointing to that place in 1890 or so when Swami Yukasar did this diagram. So it's actually right at the cusp between Pisces and Aquarius right now, and that happened in 2012, which if you shoot directly across, that would be the spring equinox where Pisces and Aquarius is closest to the galactic center. See where it says the nearest point? Okay, whereas down at the bottom where the arrow is pointing is where they believe, is where they use as a reference, which is the vernal equinox or the fall equinox. And they do that because in their discussion, part of the alignment issue is not just with the galactic center, but it's with our binary twin, our sun. So this cusp point, right, approximately just to the left of that arrow, is where humanity is supposed to go through a large awakening cycle. So every cycle of this diagram is broken up in sequences of 4 segments of 1,200 years. And it started out that the Kali Yuga cycle at the bottom was 1,000 years, and you take 1% of that either side, that adds 100 years. So you get 100 years before and 100 years after, where you get cusp, where things happen. Same with the next cycle. Since it's 2,000 years long, you take 200 years either side of that, so it comes out to 2,400. So it goes 1,200, 2,400, 3,600, and 4,800 for a total of 12,000. Okay, and those are the Kali, the Dwarpa, the Treta, and the Satya cycles. Okay, so it's real important to understand that in general, they were using this diagram to track where the solar system was relative to the galactic center, because they believed in the ascending cycle this way, human consciousness awoke to its highest point, and then from starting going this way, that it would be in its descent. And they point out that I think it was 499 AD when Muhammad was born, that is a focal point where they believe the end of the Kali Yuga cycle was. So that's right about at the bottom left here. Okay, and they use that as a point to align the rest of the zodiac with it. Okay, so hopefully that will help. So I do see that the Mayan calendar pointing to the galactic center and the Yuga cycles are correlated in that sense. Question 3. Is there a connection between Quetzalcoatl and the Mayans and Ningxia Thoth, who introduced humanity to the earliest calendars in Sumer and Egypt? Well, let's first start with Quetzalcoatl, who we came to know as the god of the Mayans. He was also known as Kukulkan, and he introduced their significant and very accurate calendar to them. And tracing back in the Anunnaki series, one of the episodes that I did focused on calendars, and we traced back Ningxia and his relationship to the calendar in Sumer, and then followed him as Thoth over into Egypt to see his relationship to the calendar there. And he was not known as the god of writing and calendars and wisdom. So he gave him the calendar, and he gave the Mayans the calendar too, and used many of the same winged serpent logos in Egypt as he used in his edifices in the Yucatan. Okay, so I do see that there's a direct connection between the Mayans and their calendar and Thoth, who definitely was involved with the calendar in Egypt. And you remember that Thoth and Marduk, who were brothers, Marduk being the older brother, both born of Enki, had a dispute over the calendar about whether it should be a solar calendar under Ra, who Amun-Ra being Marduk, and whether there should be a solar-lunar calendar mix to make it more accurate, which is what Thoth wanted. And because of that dispute, it seems to be, and this was written in The Lost Realm by Zechariah Sitchin, that was one of the reasons Thoth left Egypt to go to this new land and set up this civilization. So there you go. Question 4. How do you see the story of Atlantis involved with the high civilizations we found beneath the seas? A couple come to mind now since we've been looking. Off the coast of India, a city was found while they were cleaning up some refuse, some plastic out of the water from what I understand, and they found an entire city underwater that was approximately 5 miles in diameter and they've dated it to approximately 32,000 years ago is what they've said. And another one that comes to mind is Yamaguchi off of the coast of Japan. It's an underwater structure with very large stone blocks, megalithic kind of blocks, and I think that one was dated to approximately 18,000 years ago. That kind of coincides with Tiwanaku, which was tagged at about 17,000 years ago, and then we have Göbekli Tepe about 12,000 years ago, and it goes on. And so what I've come up to understand is by looking at what Thoth said in the Emerald Tablets when they left Atlantis, how long he ruled the land of Chem. So he said he left about 50,000 years ago in the Emerald Tablets, ruled the land of Chem, which was Egypt, for 16,000, and then they left. And that looks like about the time, that was about 34,000 years ago, at which point he says he built I'm getting ahead of myself. He built some structures there, including the Giza complex. So using that and the story of Atlantis, if that's truly the case, we know the last big ice age change happened around 12,500 years ago and coincided with a large flood, although it looks like there were other large floods that preceded even that one. If we have this city buried off the coast of Japan and elsewhere that are older than the last ice age end. So I think there were 4 major floods according to the priests of Sais in the Critias, and many minor ones. So one of the major, I think there were a sequence of them that took out Atlantis, and the last one was around the end of the last ice age, where the actual island of Undal was sunk as well, because it survived the story when they left 50,000 years ago, as you can recall. And I think Atlantis was one of the root races of humanity, one of 4 big ones that it looks like, and it looks like there's a lot of evidence of that, especially in Egypt. Okay. Question 5. Is there a connection between the god of Atlantis, who we know is Poseidon, the divine Pymander of Hermes, and Egypt's premier god Osiris with the Anunnaki? This is kind of an interesting question. It's kind of a loaded question. So, first of all, let's reestablish that Enki Poseidon was the god of Atlantis. Let's move on to the divine Pymander. Okay, this is a story in the Vision of Hermes from Manly P. Hall's book, and it's a document that existed before his book, but it's one of the oldest extant writings from Hermes, who was also Thoth. So in that account, when this universal spirit appears to him as a dragon, the commentator on that document pointed to at the time that everyone who was had read this alchemical ancient document believed that what they were talking about was Osiris. Question 6. Who does your research indicate built the Great Pyramids, and when? What is the proof? From the history of the Emerald Tablets, Thoth tells us he left Atlantis approximately 50,000 years ago and landed in Chem, ruled for 16,000, and then built the Giza complex and the Sphinx, and stated that he put his face on the body of the lion, which was in the age of Leo. So if you track back in the zodiacal wheel that I posted, that goes back to 2 precessional cycles using a non-equivalent house model, you'll see that if you go back 34,000 years, it lands you in the house of Leo, just as he said. So I thought that was a very interesting correlation. And we have other indications from the Lost Teachings of Atlantis and the history of Atlantis in those records in the book by John Peniel that also refers to the same event. Question 7. Who are the main Anunnaki players involved, and what are they responsible for, both in the past and the present? That's a pretty loaded question. I'm just going to do it short justice. So we had Anu back on Nibiru at the initialization of the story. His kids were Enki and Enlil. Enki's primary kids were Marduk and Ningshita, Thoth. And Enlil's primary kids were Ninurta and Nanar and Iskar Adad. So in the past, they occupied council positions as well as Ninmah, their half-sister. Enki and Enlil's half-sister was named Ninmah. And she was the medical officer here to serve the Anunnaki on their initial mission. Okay, let's see. Enki and Ninmah were responsible for creating mankind with a hybridization of their DNA and Neanderthal, of what it looks like. Enlil was in charge of the spaceport region up in Mesopotamia, even though Ninmah was given that region, and Enlil had Mesopotamia. And her region was actually further up near Sapar, where the spaceport was. Inanna was involved, who we know as Hathor in the Egyptian account. And I believe she was called Kali over in the Indus Valley, and that was her region. Okay, let's see. Responsible in the past and the present. Well, they were responsible for a lot of stuff. It was creating and destroying civilizations for our comparative analysis. And in the present, I believe what looks like Marduk and Enlil are opposed, or aligned and opposed to the Enkiite clan. And Marduk appears to be controlling Europe and the religions of Catholicism and Judaism. And Enlil seems to still be somewhat involved as the god of America. He was there for a very long time, since World War II, it looks like. And it's not really clear whether he's handing over control to Marduk or just what's going on. The Nation of Islam is still under Nanar, who was Allah. And the Enkyites are kind of been in recluse. They've been hiding. So I include in that as Enki and his son Thoth, since Marduk seems to have joined the other team. And Ninmah, it's not clear exactly where she might be located. From what I can tell, Thoth is in the Himalayas, playing the role as Babaji, and that's his last incarnation after Jesus. Enki, I'm not sure where he is. He seems to be very much involved with Russia. It's either Enki controlling Russia or it's Enlil's son, Ninurta. It's hard to tell. And that ought to kind of bring us to a close on who they were in the past and what they are in the present. Talking about where they are in the present can get you in a lot of trouble. So that's what I know. Question 8. Are there other races involved as well? And if so, how do they fit into the overall picture? I'll refer you back to the threat briefing analysis document that I posted a YouTube video on, where it mentioned, I don't remember the exact number, there were more than 50 races that had visited the Earth, and the document focused on 9 that were involved with mankind, and then 3 that it named that were not so benevolent to mankind. So kind of the ones that have contracts with the U.S. or other governments are the ones that I really want to focus on. And for me, those appear to be the Anunnaki, the Draco, and the Markov Gray that all seem to be in relationship, in alliance, and in contract with governments. From the U.S. standpoint, they've signed an agreement with the Markov Greys as of 1934, and then renewed that under Eisenhower in 1954. So those are 20-year. Seem to be 20-year terms, so maybe it expired, maybe it didn't. I don't really know whether it was renewed. Question 9. Is control over the evolution of human consciousness the key focal point for warring Anunnaki factions? Was this symbolized in the Garden of Eden story where 2 of the members of the Anunnaki Council were present? That was a pretty tough question, but the first part is control over the evolution of consciousness the key point? Absolutely it is, and it has been since the Garden of Eden if you look at the symbology of the story. First of all, the 2 beings that were in the garden were there to be watched to see if they could procreate. One of them told them, and this was, I believe, Enlil, who was playing God Yahweh in the Hebrew version, told the female, Eve, that if she ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that she would surely die. Well, what kind of creator would tell their created that if they were going to access wisdom, that it would kill them? I mean, think about how ludicrous that is. And the opposing force, the serpent in the garden, who was Enki, or Ningshita, one or the other. I believe it was Enki. Told her no, that you'll become like one of us. In other words, you'll gain wisdom and have the consciousness of those that are lording over you and holding you like an animal in a garden. So I think that's pretty clear that the commander, Enlil, Yahweh, did not want humanity to have higher consciousness, because look what happened in the African mines. That consciousness, that reflective consciousness, had the beings that were slaving away get together, decide what they were doing wasn't the right thing for them, and they revolted. Well, that only happens to beings that have sentient consciousness, that are aware. Keeping a person in a barbarous state like a slave animal, they don't generally think like that. They're only thinking about their primary needs of getting food and enough rest so they can work again and get food. That's what he wanted. So think about that story again as you reread it and see if that isn't actually the case, because consciousness is the key to the whole enslaving issue going on with mankind if you read it from that standpoint. Question 10. Why is consciousness such a focal point for the simulation controllers? How does it relate to slavery? I think I probably answered that question in the last one by saying too much, but the reason it's a focal point even today is the government is very much focused on putting down rebellions, and rebellions happen because of this very same issue we were talking about before, is the level of your consciousness. A conscious being knows that it's wrong, that slavery as a concept is wrong. Okay, so that's the reason why it's such a focal point. It's because the whole point for humanity was to be slaves to get resources for the Anunnaki and those they were in alliance with. So that's a really key critical point. And this goes to some of the conflicts that went between Thoth, whose mission was to raise consciousness, and Enlil, as the commander, was to suppress it, or at least that's that seemed to be his MO. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear how consciousness and slavery are related. Question 11. Could we be entering an age predicted by the Mayan calendar and the Yuga cycles in which humanity's consciousness peaks? Well, we have two calendars that we mentioned, the Mayan and the Yuga, that are both focused on the galactic center and its relationship on human consciousness, which was very important to the Mayan and apparently still very important to the Hindus who use these cycles as well as others. So the first one, using the countdown date of August 11, 3014 that we mentioned in one of the early questions relative to the Zulcan calendar from the Mayan, when you subtract where we are today, which is 2012 plus 3014, it's about 5,300 years or so. It lands you right at the place where they considered it to be the Mayan fifth sun. That means we're at the place relative to the galactic center that was important to them. That may not exactly mean that our sun went through it. I'm not quite sure, but it seems to be that's what it was indicated by the ball game, putting the rubber ball through the hoop. That's what was told to me even when I was on tour at Palenque. Anyway, so as far as the Yuga cycles are concerned, you have to look at it from the standpoint of the spring or the vernal equinox from your point of view relative to that center. So you would think that the spring equinox, where Pisces and Aquarius are closest to the point where the solar system crosses over, which is on the other side of Pisces. That's actually the center, and it lines up with and splits the Kali Yuga cycles at the bottom of Swami Yukashar's galactic timing diagram, if you will. So the fall equinox would be the side where the Dwarpa cycles are shown. And this is interesting. Remember, I told you there's 4 cycles of 1,200, or they're in increments of 1,200 years. And the first one being 1,200 years, 1,000 years with 100 either side for the Kali Yuga cycle. But then the Dwarapa cycle being the next 2,400. So there's 400 years in that cycle. on the cusp of it, the beginning and the end of it, where great changes take place. And because of the astral perspective that was taken, I think this was by, well, let's just say that it depends on where the binary twin is relative to our solar system and the galactic center, that could create an energetic sandwich, if you will, that may be even more important than when we pass through the galactic center itself. It's hard to say. So my bottom line answer is, are we entering that place? And I believe we are. Question 12. What is the purpose of fluctuating levels of consciousness as it relates to the galactic center, as denoted by the Mayan and the mystics of Indian calendars? Well, it's a very good question. First of all, I want to go back to why is the solar system fluctuating up and down through the galactic equator? That doesn't mean it's going around the galactic center around its diameter. What it means is it's being pulled around its center in an arm, while the position where it is on the arm in the galactic swing of things means that positionally, as our solar system is drug around in a circle around the galactic center, it's wobbling up and down through the galactic equator, meaning the center plane through the Milky Way galaxy. Now, actually, if you really want to be technical, it looks like there's a wobble in the center of the Milky Way galaxy that's causing the entire galaxy to wobble, just like our Earth wobbles on its axis. Well, if that was the case, then everything that was dragging with it would, by relative motion, be passing through that galactic equator that's passing by it while it stands still, or expands, depending on whether you're an ascribant to the atomic expansion theory. So why that wobble is in there in the first place? That's a design issue for the creator of all. I can't explain that other than just to create a time cycle, which all these wobbles all these time calendars are based on wobbles. If you look at it, it's really quite interesting. And relating one wobble to the other seems to be like high galactic math. Anyway, so the fact that we are in a kind of a spiral motion around our sun, which is wobbling its entire constellation, including the Earth, is transiting this galactic equator. Well, if you ask yourself why, from our perspective, living in a duality consciousness, that allows us to see ascending and descending human consciousness. So we have a way to compare between a barbarian and the light, really. That's the best that I can come up with of why it would be fluctuating. Because, could it be stopped? Could the wobble be stopped so there is no fluctuation from a creator of all standpoint? Certainly. But that's the state of things. So a lot of these calendars seem to be responding to that, and whether they figured out the levels of consciousness as it approaches the center, or the galactic equator, increases and decreases pragmatically, or whether they were told by Thoth. I believe they were told by Thoth and then established their calendars to track it, just like he said. Question 13. What is your concept of the human energy body, and how does it relate to light? Very short question, but might require a little bit to answer that. First of all, from the human energy body standpoint, I view energy as a template that's established by the creator of all, that interacts with DNA, that creates the material form that we see and call the human body. So I think energy is fundamental to the material form, and they're hard to distinguish, actually, when you start working at it from the other way, through the human fascia, coming into contact. Changing the body changes not only the mind, but the energy perception and consciousness as well. So how does that relate to light? Well, it really depends on what you consider light to be. Through my work at Light Point Communications, I thought I knew what a photon and a phonon were, and the polarities of light and how it's modeled as a particle and a wave and all that kind of stuff. It turns out I think there are properties of light that we truly don't understand, one of which is actually what it's composed of. And I want to refer to the Final Theory by Mark McCutcheon, where we discussed light specifically, and being an electrical engineer, that's really touched home with me, is that it's modeled once it leaves the atomic bonds, where it's in the expansion theory, the atomic expansion theory. Once it breaks free of bonds, these free electrons fill the universe. Sometimes they aggregate together to form electron clouds, but essentially all of it can be modeled as free electrons, including groups of them that form what we call light. So if electrons are everywhere in the universe, which we know they are, and the human body is a tremendous conductor of electricity, being mostly water, then clearly electrons are going to have a huge interaction with your body. And this goes to the concepts that are brought up in the yogic tradition that relate to the chakras being energy centers along your spine, your central spine, which is a conductor for your cerebral spinal fluid, but also electrical signals along your nerve complexes. Okay, so there's an interaction where the finite meets the infinite, which means the infinite we consider energy, which is electrons, which is light, and all the other energy that's composed and modeled after the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, so we see most people would agree that energy is eternal and it only changes state into matter and then back into energy, and it goes through these recycle processes. So nothing is ever created or destroyed; it only changes state from that standpoint. So energy is, in that standpoint, is kind of where the ball crosses over from the material form into the energetic form, versus your Ka energy, that's an energy that keeps you focused on the material world. Okay, I hope that helps. And also I did a show called How's the Soul related to light, and went a lot more detail into it on a premiere content video on my channel, Gerald Clark. Question 14. Is it possible that latent DNA circuits in the human body are energetically triggered by an event like the passage through the galactic center? Well, we just talked about the human body being sensitive to electrons and to light, even at the DNA level. For instance, the human DNA seems to come unwound in its double helix spiral if it's exposed to 528 hertz. And frequency and wavelength are just related by the speed of light, so it doesn't really matter whether we're talking frequency or wavelength. When you're shining a flashlight onto it or hitting it with an antenna with radiated energy, it really just depends on whether the biology is sensitive to the wavelength or the frequency that it's being exposed to. And we know with a laser, well, light, you can burn things, and similarly, you can do the same thing with an antenna. Certain microwave frequencies will burn your skin. So, is it possible that latent circuits in the human body could be energetically triggered? Well, are there time triggers that we naturally see in the human body that regulate things like growth hormone, for instance? Certainly there are. So, and all the hormones that take place through adolescence that cause all the way up through puberty, for instance, these are essentially latent circuits in your body that are triggered maybe by a biological function, but they could be correlated with time. So how does the body know that it's time to no longer grow adult teeth after you lost your baby teeth and grew one more set, for instance? So things like that. So if the human body is sensitive to certain frequencies, for instance, and we know this is true through Ayurvedics, then I think it's highly possible that passing through a high energy band or an electron cloud, our whole solar system going through an electron cloud could cause some tremendous changes. And if it changes the sun, which regulates all life, then we would be changed as well. Okay? Question 15. How do you see the state of humanity in relationship to universal consciousness, ascension, reincarnation, and the bigger picture? Well, I like to ask hard questions, don't I? Well, so actually, I don't know that the state of humanity in terms of the evolution of their consciousness has really changed that much in 2,000 years in the last zodiacal house, from what I can tell. That said, I do think there have been changes in the human consciousness based on the rollout of the Mayan calendar being in the last of the 9th rows of universal consciousness. I think we're just at the cusp of that, but it's starting to show up as an overall state. And I think a lot of it is intentional because of some of the decisions made by higher consciousness beings to expose lower consciousness civilizations to their tools. For instance, in 1935, I guess it was, is when the Yogananda was sent by Babaji to the United States to share Kriya Yoga. And there have been other similar instances where cross-cultural contamination, if you will, have led to a higher state of consciousness. So as far as their relationship to universal consciousness, I would say there's a portion of the populace all through the ages that is seeking that, and they're willing to do what it takes to find that. And some of them reach enlightenment, which means they've got to the energy state where they can ascend if they want or stay if they want. And the ones that stay end up being teachers. The ones that don't end up ascending. And as far as that goes, there's strong evidence for reincarnation, especially in India with the Dalai Lama, keeping track of how many incarnations there have been with Dalai Lama. And that one, it stays very specific to that order. Whereas in the Lost Teachings of Atlantis, their reincarnated teachers end up landing all over the world and then finding their way back to the schools. It's very interesting. They generally think that they find their way back, that the reincarnated teachers anyway find their way back by the age of 21. So that's pretty interesting to know. So in the bigger picture, I think there are energetic windows like what we see in the Yuga cycle right now. And this comes from the Holy Science by Swami Yukasar, and he was taught this by Babaji Thoth as well, Ningshita. So there's a cusp window right now, and this was pointed out in Drumballo's book, Ancient Secrets of the Flower of Life, Drumballo Melchizedek. And it was in volume 1, where it was talking about the processional cycles and showed the same picture from Swami Yukasar's Ascension and Descension diagram of the zodiacal wheel. And had pointed out that location where he thought they were, using the exact known time of the Kali Yuga cycle to establish where they were. So based on that, and if you look at the non-equivalent house model that I showed, it counts backwards in time from the edge of Pisces, the cusp of Pisces and Aquarius, and starts reversing the zodiac that way. But if you go clockwise and start adding the exact transit times in those houses, you'll see that in 2012 AD, if you take 1986.37 and you add it to 26 AD, you'll end up with 2012.37 or so, something like that. So, but basically, you'll end up at 2012 at the point where we enter the age of Aquarius. Okay, and that actually agrees with Thoth's countdown calendar from August 11th, 3014. So in the big scheme of things, people may think nothing happened around 2012, but I think we entered a frequency dispensation that now is going to just continue to accelerate until we reach the galactic center. And at each time we hit one of those cusps in the, we left the Kali Yuga cycle, so we won't see that until we get back all the way around. But in the Dwarpa cycle, there's a cusp entering and exiting that have a huge impact on human consciousness. Same thing with the next cycle, the Treta Yuga cycle. And then the Satya Yuga cycle at the spring equinox lands and crosses right over on the boundary of Aquarius and Pisces. I'm sorry, Aquarius and at Aries and Pisces. That's where the central point is. And the other side is Libra and Virgo. And I found that's really interesting because Leo, I believe, was Ningshita's sign when he showed up as Thoth in Egypt. That's why he made the Sphinx and the sign of the lion with his face on it. And Virgo oftentimes is fought over as a sign. We got a ice cream truck going by. Okay. Anyway, so I believe this is why he and Ninmah share an archetype on the Magi card with a hermaphroditic shared energy of male and female. Well, the other place we see that is in the Hindu religion with Shiva and Parvati. Oftentimes they're shown as conjoint beings, but apparently they were distinct by that point where they were incarnating as male and female. But in the prior history in the Lost Teachings of Atlantis, they talked about when the beings that were originally here were hermaphroditic as well. This has been Gerald Clark with Seven Planet Broadcasting, and we'll catch up with you guys next time when we have a Q&A. Thanks for listening.